Guys, welcome back. For the first time in 2026, officially, we've seen F1 cars on track. That's right, week one of Bahrain preseason testing is now over, and we have some things to talk about. It's going to be a relatively quick turnaround because at the end of the day, this truly is just preseason testing, and there's only so much you can take away from these. But at the same time, that's not going to stop me from absolutely overreacting to some stuff, both good and bad. We're going to be talking about, just most notable highlights. I think the biggest things that came out of it, and as well as talk about our, testing week one winners and losers. Once again, it's all for fun. You obviously will have no idea what these teams are actually about until a handful of weeks from now, with Australia looming large. But let's go ahead, let's jump on into this thing and talk about what we saw in week one of preseason testing. Let's go ahead and kick this off with, just a couple of the notable things that we saw over the course of a week one. Over 3 days, we saw all the teams take the track for the first time, actually, with everyone managing to put a car on the grid. Williams making their debut, as well as everyone getting an opportunity to try and make sure that, what they have prepared is lining up to what they're expecting. As fans, we're excited now to see these cars on track officially, getting official times, getting a good look. Obviously, these were like 3 8+ hour days. Obviously, we were only limited to seeing a very small fraction of that broadcast, but at the same time, it was a lot of fun to see these new cars on track for the first time in an official, unofficial capacity. I think the first thing that we got to talk about when it comes to week one of preseason testing, I think, is about the new regs. Obviously, going into the new year, we've talked about it a lot, both in all of our team previews as well as our season predictions video. But the new regulations are the first and foremost thing that we have to talk about when it comes to the lead up of the 2026 season. We saw a lot of things kind of pertaining to it that I actually saw were brought up by those around the paddock as well as people online. And that's just like, we saw so many questions and unknowns about what is actually going to happen, and it seems like they don't have a lot of answers. I think the biggest thing when it comes to the regs and a safety issue perspective is this practice race start that we saw, where it looked like only about half the cars that actually partook actually were able to make it off the line, as well as Franco Colapinto and his Alpine going into anti-stall before he even reached turn one. So I think race starts actually became quite a heavy topic when that happened, because it came out that apparently these cars need almost 10 seconds of basically not even idling, but just like throttling in neutral to get the turbo spun up before they can have a normal launch off the line. And so there's a lot of questions about what they're going to do about this, what's going to happen, will the teams figure out a workaround, etc., etc. But it was a bit of a S show, to say the least, when it came to these cars being able to get off the line. We saw multiple clips, not only of that practice race start, of the at the end of the pit lane when teams were able to pull off to the side and sort of do their own practice starts. There were a lot of issues going on with getting off the line. So that is definitely going to be something that we're going to have to keep an eye out going forward, because they only have so much time to figure it out, and we have a lot of questions lingering when it comes to those. Another thing I saw mentioned online is like, what sort of information is going to be given to us, the viewer, when it comes to a lot of these new regulations. There's obviously a much higher priority on the battery side, the energy storage side. It's come out over the course of the secret shakedown, as well as this week, that these laps are basically going to come down to who can able to harvest and utilize their energy to the best of their ability. We saw famous quotes come out from Max Verstappen about this being Formula E on steroids, and based on what we've seen so far, I don't think he's entirely wrong. Obviously, the battery becoming one of the bigger components in the the entire power unit structure as a whole is going to leave a lot to be desired, I think. And I think we saw that a little bit in multiple facets, where it really is coming down to who can generate the most energy back into the battery, who can utilize it to the most, to its highest efficiency. And as well, one of the biggest things that we've seen is, I think, that pertains to that, which was brought up a long time ago when these regulations were starting to be talked about, is the fact that we saw issues with cars reaching their top speed, running out of that electrical energy, and effectively losing power by the time they hit the end of the straight. And if this is happening in Bahrain, I can only imagine what's going to be happening by the time we get to Monza, Baku. Spa is going to be a big one. It's just these circuits with these really long straights. Are we going to be seeing cars only having 150, 200 horsepower by the time they get to that next corner? Time will tell, and they're going to have to get it figured out, because it's not a great look when you're hitting your top speed and then before you even reach the corner, you are having to scrub speed because you go from having 1,000 horsepower to having 200 horsepower. So realistically, I think they still have a lot to figure out when it comes to these regs, and it is very interesting the ways that we're going to have to see these teams figure it out and work around them and try and figure out what best works for them, because so far there's a lot of questions and I'm not sure they have many answers to them as of right now. I think the only other thing we can really take away from this is start talking about which teams seemed like they got it right, see which teams might be right where we expected them to be, and see if there are any teams that are seriously behind the 8 ball so far. Obviously, there are some teams which are basically right where you would expect them to be, but I think there are some teams that deserve mentioning. They are teams that seem to be ahead of schedule. There were a lot of questions going into as testing season started about whether or not they would be able to get it right, see what would actually look like on track, and they're actually seemingly getting it correct. So if we start with taking a look at a few teams that seem to be getting it right, I think the big teams for this category are going to be Red Bull and Ferrari. Obviously, there were a lot of question marks around Red Bull creating their own powertrain with Ford, and there was a lot of questions about whether or not it would be reliable, performative, things like that. And obviously, it's still pretty early doors so far, but ultimately, I think so far they have performed well above expectations. I think there was a lot of unknowns about it, but over the course of the shakedown and this first week of preseason testing, they put a lot of mileage on it. It showed a pretty decent amount of pace and efficiency when it comes to battery usage, and I think it was a solid showing so far for the new Red Bull Ford power unit. The same can be said for Ferrari. There was a lot of conversations about other power units preseason, and everyone was sort of brushing off Ferrari as maybe heading towards that second tier. Obviously, you have the rumors about the Mercedes engine. Red Bull seemed to have unlocked a little bit of something in their power unit. But at the same time, Ferrari has silently just marched along both in the shakedown tests as well as week 1 here in Bahrain. Obviously, the Ferrari power unit has logged a lot of kilometers, a lot of miles, a lot of laps over the course of these 2 sessions, and I think it's been very impressive. Obviously, other teams with Ferrari power units are behaving kind of there on their own. Haas obviously also showed a lot of promise with that power unit as well, both in the shakedown and here in week 1. There was even the rumor that said Ferrari was still running the same power unit that they were in the Barcelona shakedown here in week 1. Will that be the same one that they run in week 2? Time will tell, but it is definitely a positive showing for Ferrari, which a lot of people, I think, were not really giving them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to building a performative engine. If we move on now and take a look at teams who are right on track, obviously, if I don't mention a team here, I think there's still maybe a bit too many unknowns, or there are sort of still on track, but I think there are some that I think are worth talking about more than others. Those 3 being Cadillac, Audi, and Williams. The 3 teams that realistically going into the season we had the least amount of information on. Obviously, Audi has had a lot of time to develop their car, but are now dealing with the tangential side effects of taking over a team, taking over for Sauber following their successful 25 season. Cadillac, on the other hand, had a bit of less lead time, but are dealing with the tangential things of having to build a race team from the ground up. Obviously, I think both of these teams are still very much in the process of gathering and learning as much about data and information and characteristics of the car as they can. I think this is going to be a good, not necessarily a make or break moment going into the season, but I think how they transition from the shakedowns to week 1 of testing to week 2 of testing is going to tell us a lot about what these teams can expect going into 2026. And I think so far they have been pretty on track, I would say. It's very clear that they still have a lot of learning to do, and they have not necessarily made any major revelations anywhere on the grid. But at the same time, it's nice to see them get out there, be in the spot I think we expected them to be, learning everything they can and being very much on track. Williams in a similar place, but obviously having been a very well established race team. There were the spot that Williams is in, I think I wanted to highlight them here, is they obviously missed the entire Barcelona shakedown. There were rumors flying around about Williams, about what was going on there. But now that they come to week one of preseason testing, they're able to put a car on track, log a decent amount of mileage, and didn't look half bad doing it. Obviously, there are still a lot of question marks around Williams and what they're going to look like here in this season. But at the same time, it's nice to see them get out on track. Obviously, it's nice the fact that they were able to put a car on track at all following Barcelona. But at the same time, I think the fact that they are right on track, I think it speaks volumes to where they went from not only a couple of weeks ago in Barcelona, or not even in Barcelona, to now here in Bahrain. I think they can definitely say they satisfied a lot of the public opinion and of the public questions that were sort of surrounding them. They were able to put a car out. They were able to start learning and running tests and logging mileage. And I think they definitely try to take advantage of that to the tune of more than a few hundred laps. I can't remember the exact number of laps they did, but it was definitely up there in terms of total laps across everyone else on the grid. So obviously, I think very similarly to the other two I mentioned in this category, there is going to be a big pressure for them moving from week 1 to week 2 of Bahrain preseason testing, because they are going to be looking at week 2 as their last opportunity of on-track action to really gather as much data as they possibly can in those sessions. So something to keep an eye out for sure. And then our last category here are teams that didn't necessarily get it right. And I think this is something that is specifically catered, and I put this section in here specifically for one team and one team only. You can say it with me, Aston Martin. Obviously, everyone was going into 2026 following their 2025 season, where it became very clear that they were stacking up as much research into the 2026 car as possible. They effectively threw away 2025 in their minds. Obviously they tried, but at the same time, everything was leading up to this season. Adrian Newey's first at the helm of Aston Martin, and I don't think anyone would be more surprised than them to see that they are quite a bit off the pace when it comes to the rest of the grid. I, for one, was cautiously optimistic about Aston Martin. Obviously, a team getting Adrian Newey is only going to have the benefit of the doubt a lot of the time, but to come in and have your drivers make comments and behave like they did, I think says a lot. Obviously, you have to take a lot of week 1 of preseason testing with a grain of salt. That is not lost on me. You have no idea what other teams were doing, but considering you have Lance Stroll commenting and saying that they have to find 4 to 4.5 seconds of performance as compared to the rest of the grid, it is a worrying sign, to say the least. You saw a few clips of Fernando Alonso visibly frustrated by the performance of the car. They obviously coming off of the Barcelona shakedown, where they only made, I believe, the last 2 days of that, and they had to run it with a power limit, I believe, or a speed limiter on the car. I think a lot of people then turned their eyes towards week 1 of preseason testing, and it certainly definitely did not live up to the hype that they had been building over the offseason. So if there is one team to go in the getting it wrong category so far, I think it has to be Aston Martin, unfortunately. All right, let's go ahead and move on and make some overgeneralizations about 1 week of preseason testing as compared to nothing else. And so let's talk our week winners and losers when it comes to preseason testing. And we'll begin with our weekend winners, testing week 1 winners, which I am actually going with Mercedes here because, one, we haven't really talked about them much. We had talked about them plenty leading up to basically this week. And so I think it's now time to talk about them, because I am in the camp that thinks Mercedes is holding back currently. That said, they were still the only team to put a 133X on the board as compared to the rest of the grid. No one else was able to dip into the 33s. There were a handful of teams that were able to get into the 34s, but definitely well off the pace as compared to the Mercedes. And even that, I'm going to mean this in the nicest way possible, that it has to feel good for Mercedes to, one, lay down the fastest lap overall of the week, and for it to have been Kimi Antonelli to do it. Obviously, we've seen Kimi have some pace in the past. Obviously, I think that's kind of what has been expected of him. At the same time, there haven't necessarily been those signs of a jump from Kimi Antonelli. And so to see him go out there and comfortably put in the fastest lap of the entire week is got to have them feeling well, especially when I won't necessarily go as far and say they're sandbagging, but I do think they still have a lot left to offer in terms of performance. Obviously, all of it's with a grain of salt. We have no idea what every other team was doing when they were doing their fast runs, but it has to feel good for Mercedes, at least at this point, to know that based on this, they can go fastest on the grid, and I'm sure they're going to be taking that away from here, feeling pretty good about themselves. And then I think it's going to be pretty obvious who we're going with for testing week 1 losers. It is Aston Martin. I mentioned that Mercedes was able to put down a 130, I think it was a 133.6 and change lap done by Kimi Antonelli there on the final day of testing. Aston Martin's fastest lap laid over the entire 3 days of testing was done by Fernando Alonso, and it was a 138.248, and so it is a full 4.5 seconds off the pace. Once again, you can only take it so much grain of salt. You can only take it at face value so much. It is just really unfortunate to have them leave week 1 of testing and have those sorts of numbers put beside their name versus where I'm sure they were hoping to be much closer to. Obviously, every other team falls well within that range. They're not 4.5 seconds off the next slowest team. It is to the front, presumably the leaders going into the season in the Constructors' Championship. At the same time, I don't know if there was any team more blindsided by the lack of performance than Aston Martin. And obviously, hoping they come out in week 2 with a little more performance unlocked. But at the same time, if you're an Aston Martin fan, maybe start tempering your expectations accordingly. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up our week 1 takeaways by talking about the lingering questions in between now and next week when week 2 of preseason testing begins. And I think you have to start at the front. And the biggest question that I'm not even sure we're going to get answered next week, but I think it is a big question still lingering, is there are a lot of accusations of Mercedes continuing to still sandbag, even though they did go out and lay the fastest time out there of any team. So one of the biggest questions lingering is how much, if any, is Mercedes still holding back? We honestly will never know, but I am very curious to see what the performance will look like next week, as I'm sure teams are going to start turning up the wick on the engines just a little bit more, just to try and actually get a good representation or calculation of what their performance ceiling might look like. So we could start to see the teams go a little bit faster, start to see them turn up the engine, start to refine the techniques, the setups, the tuning of every system to work as one. And I think I'm very curious to see if Mercedes can continue to hold the large gap that they have so far. Another lingering question will be, will any other team start to really push it? There were a couple of teams there in the top 4 that realistically were pretty close together. Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren, obviously all still right there. Will any of them start to really take a step up from week 1 to week 2 and start to maybe challenge Mercedes a bit more? I'm interested to see if that comes up. Speaking of outside the top 4, are any team outside the top 4 going to make a big step forward after getting a full week to sort of digest and learn about their car, potentially bring first rounds of upgrades, try some new things? And will anyone else start to separate themselves from the bottom of the pack, the bottom of the, in the midfield, separate themselves up more towards that top 4? I think if there was a team to do that in week 1, I speak as a Haas fan. I think it actually was Haas. Obviously, we saw relatively consistent lap times. We saw consistent running, consistent performance. Aldi Behrman was able to lay down a lap that was comparable to a lot of the top 4 teams. Obviously, once again, grain of salt, asterisks everywhere. But at the same time, it must be a nice showing for the Haas team to sort of get out and seem like they are able to find some performance. I'm very curious to see what my team can do going into next week's preseason testing. Hopefully they can continue on that trajectory and continue to separate themselves from the rest of the pack. I am looking forward to that. And then lastly, I think the last thing I'm curious about and lingering questions are what sort of information or revelations are going to come from Formula One and the FIA around these new regulations. What sort of information are we going to be privy to as watchers on through the television? Obviously, there's so many factors about this new regulation set that we realistically need to know what is going to be available for us to know. They have basically the new push to pass system. They have the new active arrow system. There's very interested to see how they're going to help us differentiate and learn the different aspects of this regulation set from a viewer's perspective. And I think there is going to be a lot of that also there's obviously the race starts conversations, what they're going to do about that. There's the whole rumor thing about how Ferrari apparently brought this up forever ago and was basically ignored. And so now all the other teams are trying to leverage the FIA to change whatever, and Ferrari are trying to block it because they tried to bring it up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's going to be a lot of politicking going on behind the scenes, and I'm curious to see what comes out of it as we head now towards week 2 of preseason testing. But guys, thank you for watching my thoughts on week 1 of preseason testing. Only 1 week remains and we get it more than just not even more, less than a couple of days from now. And then from there, we are in a march towards round 1 in Australia. If you made it this far into the video, I appreciate you and assume you are just as excited for the start of the 2026 season as I am. Let me know in the comment section down below what your main takeaway was from week 1 of testing. It could be a team, it could be a driver, it could be something completely unrelated to any of the above, but I'm curious to see what you guys took away from week 1. And as always, if you haven't already, subscribe, join our little community, and prepare yourselves for the 2026 season right along with us. We'll be back in a week to talk about what we saw in week 2 of Bahrain preseason testing, and I, for one, can't wait to see it.